Now, I'd like to welcome Chris Hendricks, who's president of Featherstone LLC, to introduce a beloved speaker whom we are familiar. Chris?
Thank you. Thank you, President Karen. First of all, I mean, how lucky am I? I get to introduce the one speaker that doesn't need any introduction. Rob has spoken to our club many, many times. He's the winner of our Rotary Person of the Year in 2019. And he was recently profiled as a Rotary Person of Action. So, however, for those who are new and for our visitors, I'll still give you a little bit of info on Rob's background. He's the president of the Wisconsin Policy Forum, a position he has held since 2008, and I was on the search committee, so I take some credit for that. Since joining the forum, Rob has authored or co-authored 6 reports that won national awards from the Government Research Association. Before Rob became forum president, he worked in Milwaukee County government for nearly 10 years, serving as a director of research for the county board, director of health and human services, and director of administrative services. He's also directed nonprofit organizations in Milwaukee, the Alliance for Future Transit, and the Milwaukee Jobs Initiative. Prior to moving to Milwaukee in 1994, at the urging of his wife, who grew up in not Bayview, Bayside. He's worked for 7 years on Capitol Hill as a senior aide to 2 congressmen and as a staff director for a House Representative of Foreign Affairs Committee. He's got a bachelor's degree in history from Brown University and a master's in journalism. As I thought about my introduction, I really thought about the quote that is attributed to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. That quote exemplifies the mission and work of the forum. Having been involved personally in the forum for more than 35 years and serving for about 25 years as a trustee, officer, and emeritus trustee, I can testify that Rob and his staff live that quote and what's behind it every single day. And because Rob can't say this, I will tell you all that the forum is a membership organization, and that if you believe that the work that they do is important, please consider joining the forum as a member and supporting this organization. Thank you, and Rob?
So first of all, thank you so much for that very warm introduction, Chris. It's really a pleasure to be here in front of this very esteemed group. Some of you may recall, I think one of the very last times that Mayor Tom Barrett addressed the club, he was referencing some forum research, and he referred to me as Milwaukee's buzzkill. So unfortunately, that is a hat that I wear, I don't know, proudly is the right word, but I wear it. And also, unfortunately, I'm afraid I'm not going to disappoint this afternoon, because when we talk about the story of City of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County finances, I wish I had some good news to share. And actually, at the end, I will share a little bit of good news, because I think we're further along than I've ever seen us in terms of working toward consensus on some solutions to these problems. But before going there, I think it's very important to understand the dimensions of the problem. And so, again, I'm very grateful to Mary and the club for giving me this opportunity to present today. So I'm going to run through some slides. I want to stay up here. For those of you who know me in the forum, we tend to go into the weeds at times. This is not one of those times. I'm going to start off by talking about the structure that we as a state have created in terms of how we finance local governments, and then drill down into how that structure has impacted our 2 largest local governments in the state, the City of Milwaukee and Milwaukee County. So first of all, we do have some street credibility on these issues and some experience. The Wisconsin Policy Forum, and Chris gave the the 30-second elevator speech better than I've ever done it. So again, thank you, Chris. But we have been reviewing city and county budgets every year for the past several years since I came to the forum. In 2008, we produce annual 20 to 25 page budget briefs. So the set of conditions that I'm going to talk about this afternoon are not ones that have caught us by surprise necessarily. We have watched as some real alarming points have gotten worse and worse over the years. But still, where we stand today, I would say to you, is more alarming than I think I could have dreamed when we first started doing this. So let's start with Wisconsin's unique structure, as this slide says. We, the forum, have dug into this. So we have not only looked at the finances of our city and county government here, as well as some of our largest school districts, but we've looked at the structure that we as a state have put in place in terms of, again, how we allow our municipal governments to generate the revenues that they need to provide the vital services that they provide. So these two reports, and by the way, all the research that I'm referencing is available on our website, wispolicyforum.org, and I'll maybe do a test for Rotarians at some point in the future to see if you've actually read it. But these two reports are reports that we did after having covered the city and the county, again, year after year. We decided to say, let's look across the state at municipalities and counties in general. Let's take a look at how they are faring in terms of their revenue structures, and let's also take a look at the spending side of the equation. So a few tidbits from these reports. This is our structure for financing our local governments. This slide is just showing you municipal governments. As I'll show you in just a second, it's pretty similar for county governments. But what is important about this slide? Well, first of all, you can see that big divergence. What the darker bars are the U.S. Average in terms of, for each of those specific forms of revenue, the percentage as a share of the overall total revenue pie for, in this case, municipal governments, cities and villages, not towns, but cities and villages in each of the 50 states. So whereas the national average, the dark bars are the national average, the blue bars are the Wisconsin average. So what stands out here immediately is the property tax. Whereas nationally, the average is that property taxes are about 24% of that overall revenue pie. Here in the state of Wisconsin, for our cities and villages, it's about 42%. So a real clear point of divergence. If you're wondering why property taxes are very high in the state of Wisconsin, it's because we have set up a structure that essentially says to our local units of government, that is your one game in town. In terms of the big three of taxation, income, sales, and property, we as a state only authorize our municipal governments, with a small handful of exceptions for certain resort communities. In Door County, for example, they're allowed to do a sales tax. But otherwise, really, it is just the property tax. So that stands out. What is also distinctive here in terms of state aid, our structure, the structure we have set up, is we have said, hey, we're going to be very generous as a state government to our municipal governments in terms of providing state aids to them. So really you're seeing on this slide that we're relatively close to the national average in Wisconsin, but if you were to just isolate our largest cities in the state are the biggest beneficiaries of a program called the State Shared Revenue Program, and so you'd see a bigger gap there. What also stands out here is the sales tax, whereas it is the norm in most other states to allow municipal governments, particularly largest municipal governments. Missouri is a perfect example of a very red state that is just about as restrictive as we are in terms of the types of taxation that they allow their municipalities to pursue. But for their largest cities, Kansas City and St. Louis, they do allow sales taxes. They actually allow local income taxes as well. And that is in part recognition of the fact that your largest cities tend to have a base of service users that expands far beyond the resident and the property ownership population. So there are tens of thousands of non-city residents who commute into the city of Milwaukee to work every day, and they're using city services every day. There are millions of non-residents who come to Milwaukee every year for entertainment, to go to Bucks games and Brewers games and Summerfest and so on. And so having sort of a balanced portfolio of taxation recognizes that if you are an entity where your users of your municipal services extend beyond your city boundaries, it may make sense to look to some additional forms of taxation outside of property taxation in terms of your funding sources. So again, keep this slide in mind as I go forward. This just compares us to other Midwestern states. The dark bar is the property tax. The blue bar is other taxes. And again, you can see how we are sort of off the charts when compared to our Midwestern neighbors in terms of our municipalities' reliance on the property tax versus other taxes. I said that the county revenue structure was similar. This essentially shows you how county governments in the state of Wisconsin generate their revenues. The one distinction between counties and municipalities, these ratios are roughly the same, whether you look at county governments or municipal governments, is that county governments do have access to a small sales tax. So back in the early 1990s, the state did give counties the authority to raise up to a half-cent sales tax. Now that compares to the state sales tax of 5 cents. So it doesn't generate a lot of money compared to the state sales tax, but it does give county governments a little extra that 68 of the 72 counties in the state have used. But as you can see, property taxes and intergovernmental revenues, the vast majority of which are state aids, still are the major revenue sources that support our counties. So let's now take a look at spending, because I spend a lot of time on revenues, and people out there justifiably say to me, hey, Rob, why are you only focusing on revenues? How do we compare to other states in terms of local government spending? And what you can see on this slide is that we are essentially average. We are 15th out of the 50 states in terms of overall per capita local government spending. But if you look at the averages, we are actually slightly below the national averages, both in terms of our per capita local spending and our per capita state spending. So I'm sorry, this is both local and state spending. We are, roughly speaking, average. But a very distinctive feature here on the spending side is that our spending is mostly local. So I told you about our revenue structure. Unusually high reliance for our local governments on property taxes and on state aids. On the spending side, our state government relies on its local governments for a much greater share of the cost of local service provision than in many other states. So what you are seeing here is actually police spending. If you looked at other major functions, you'd see something similar. So this is a little bit tough to see, but we're right in the middle there. And so when it comes to police spending, we rank 23rd of the 50 states in terms of per capita police spending. So again, roughly average. But as you can see, where we rank extremely high or on the high side is in the amount of municipal and county dollars going into the police function. We are dead last in terms of state dollars going into the police function. Now, does that mean that our approach is better or worse than other states? I'm not going to go there. You could argue it both ways. But again, it's a distinctive feature. And as I said, you would find this if you looked at public works, if you looked at public health, if you looked at fire and EMS, roughly the same. We rely much more on our local governments. So again, keep this in mind. Our structure is heavy reliance on shared revenues and state aids and property taxes. Lots of additional responsibility when compared to other states in terms of local spending. So why am I giving you all of this background? Because the structure that we have created is really suffering from some very significant flaws that have developed over many, many years. So when it comes to the property tax, again, you saw the amount of reliance. Our state government in 2006 also adopted some very stringent restrictions on the ability of local governments to increase property taxes from year to year. And this is really very much a good news and a bad news story. We put out a report every year on the so-called tax burden, which we measure as the amount of taxation for the citizens of this state as a percentage of the income they earn. And we were, as recently as the beginning of the turn of the century, we were in the top 5 or 6 in terms of heaviest tax burden for our citizens. Over time, between the early 2000s and today, we have dropped to the middle of the pack there. So clearly, these property tax levy restrictions on local governments, as well as revenue limits on K-12 schools, have had a very positive impact in terms of the tax burden. However, where this has fallen short is that we essentially tie these revenue restrictions to, that are there for local governments to something called net new construction. So the premise is that you as a local government can only increase your property tax for operating purposes from year to year by a percentage that is no more than the percentage increase you saw in the previous year in your property tax base as a result of new construction. And the premise here is a sound one. In an ideal world, we wouldn't want people's property taxes to go up if they're reassessed and the value of their existing property goes up. We would much rather tie property tax increases to net new construction. So as a principle, it makes sense. Where it has fallen short, however, is that this slide right here, the dark line is the average annual change in net new construction, and the lighter blue line is the average annual change in the consumer price index. So net new construction has tended to lag CPI, and so the ability of local governments to generate additional property tax levy resources from year to year, generally speaking, and there are exceptions in the property tax levy limits, but generally speaking, have lagged inflation. So why is that a problem? Well, because I just told you how reliant we make our local governments on property taxes. If that is your number one revenue source, and I don't care if you're a government, if you're a business, if you're an individual, if your main source of income is not increasing, generally speaking, at the rate of inflation, and that's the case year after year after year after year, then ultimately you are likely to have some very fierce pressures on the expenditure side. By the same token, again, the second biggest source of revenue for local governments in the state of Wisconsin. For some, it's number one. It depends on the government. For others, it's number two. But the shared revenue program, which is a very important form of state aid. What we are showing you on this slide is, and these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. So on the one hand, you can argue that the state of Wisconsin spends a lot of money on shared revenue, on collecting its own revenue from its income tax and sales tax and other forms of general purpose revenue, and redistributing a portion of that back out to its local governments. That pool is a little bit more than $900 million a year. A lot of money, no matter how you slice it. The problem is, as you can see by that blue line, in nominal terms, that dollar amount has not gone up since the early 1990s. Compare that to the state's own major form of revenue, or largest form of revenue, the income tax, and the state has enjoyed steady growth in income tax collections, despite lots of income tax adjustments that have resulted in cuts for many taxpayers. So again, why do I say this to you? Because if you have set up a structure where you are heavily reliant on two major revenue sources, and those two major revenue sources not only are not growing at the pace of CPI, but in the case of the shared revenue program, isn't growing at all, again, that is going to create some very significant challenges for you. So, with that background, let's talk for the next 10 minutes or so before we get to questions about how this has impacted our city government in Milwaukee and our county government, as well as some other factors. So let's start with the city. What this is showing you is the four major forms of revenue on which city government relies. So I've already talked ad nauseum about two of them, property taxes and state aid. Another couple are federal aid for city government. That traditionally has not been a huge source of revenue. Now that changed a couple of years ago with the pandemic and these huge federal pandemic relief packages. That's why you see that green line sharply going upward in the as we approach 2020. And then charges for service are another source of revenue that the city relies upon: snow and ice removal fees, garbage collection fees, etc. Important to note, however, those fees are linked to property ownership. But here you see that once upon a time in 2000, state aid accounted for more than 40% of the city of Milwaukee's general revenue. The property tax about 20%. Because that state aid has not moved at all for more than 25 years, that share, as we now fast forward to 2021, has dropped below 30%. In the meantime, while property tax levy growth has been limited, there has been a little bit of growth, and so therefore, as we stand here today, the property tax now has slightly exceeded shared revenue in terms of being the city's largest revenue source. But again, the shrinkage of state aid on an inflationary basis for the city of Milwaukee has been one of its foremost challenges. That net new construction that I told you about and some other factors has also limited growth in the city's operating levy. So here you can simply see, I showed you in an earlier slide what the statewide average looked like compared to the growth in the consumer price index. Here we're simply showing you that Milwaukee's average growth in net new construction has even lagged behind the state average. So what has that meant? It has not only meant shrinking resources, but when combined with what I'm about to tell you about on this slide, it has really created now a fiscal crisis, because not only has the growth of the state aids and the property tax been restricted, but over time, city leaders have been required to use more and more of their general revenues not to pay for core city services, which are the dark blue bar are general city purpose revenues. So those are the revenues that pay for the police department, the fire department, public health, public works, the libraries. We have Joan here, I can't forget the libraries, the Department of Neighborhood Services, etc. The core city services with which we are all familiar. Unfortunately, at the same time that revenues have been flat, greater shares of those stagnant property tax levy revenues in particular have had to go not to core city services, but as we're showing you in this snapshot from the past decade, more has had to go to city debt payments. The city has aging infrastructure and has had to issue more and more debt over the years to take care of that infrastructure, and also the pension fund. And I'll get to that story in just a moment. So 2022 is really an anomaly in this slide because they pumped in all of this federal pandemic relief aid. But even if you look at 2012 to 2021, and you can't see the numbers, but in 2012, the city was devoting about $109 million of its property tax revenue to its core services. Fast forward 10 years later to 2021, that was about $112 million. So again, the amount of property tax levy that the city has had to spend on its core functions has just not even come remotely close to keeping up with inflation over time. What has been the consequence of that? There have been cutbacks in city government. For the most part, with some exceptions, those have been sort of a drip, drip, drip over the years. We all know the story. The Milwaukee Police Department has cut more than 180 sworn officers over the past 3 or 4 years. Fire department has seen some real cuts, but there have been some real workforce reductions at city government over the past several years, as one might have expected given the picture that I just painted. Another very alarming factor for us, and I said that as I stand here today, the situation has even grown worse than I could have imagined. 5, 6 years ago, when I presented one of our deep dives to the Rotary Club on city finances to the Rotary Club, I pointed out that one of the distinctions between city government at the time and county government was that the city at least had ample reserves that it could tap into to try to smooth over some of the rough times ahead. And once upon a time, that was true. What this is showing you, and I don't want to go into the weeds here, but the city has something called a tax stabilization fund. It's a key reserve that the city has that exists for the express purpose of being able to shift some dollars from that fund into the general operating budget in particularly tough budget years to be able to keep down the amount of taxation and fee increases, and also to avoid severe cuts in services. And so you look back as recently as 5, 6 years ago, and because the city had a very well-funded tax stabilization fund, they were able to make transfers of $18 to $20 to $27 million in one year into the general fund. Well, the reason you now see that number going down precipitously over the past 5 years is that the fund is quite simply being depleted. Reserves are great when you have them, but as you use them, they get depleted. You don't have them anymore. And so as we now look into the years going forward, this very key reserve for the city of Milwaukee has all but been depleted, which adds to the fiscal challenges that the city faces. Finally, I referenced the debt issue just a couple moments ago, but this is another factor that has made the overall prognosis look even worse. The city is now using upwards of 30% of its total tax levy to service its long-term debt. And so that means fewer resources available for core city services. Finally, to the extent that anyone has been following this in the newspapers, you know that the real precipitating factor, what has turned this, converted this from an extremely challenging financial predicament to a full-fledged fiscal crisis, is what is going on with the city's pension fund. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but there have been numerous factors, including the fact that the city had to lower its expected rate of return on its pension fund investments to match what has been going on with the markets, et cetera. As a result, whereas the city over the past 5 years has been committing about $80 million annually to its pension fund, which is, as you can see on this slide, still far more than it was committing prior to 2012. That number is going to have to jump to upwards of 120 to 125 to maybe even 140 or 150 million dollars in the years to come. And so here you have a government that has seen no revenue growth, that has depleted reserves, that has growing long-term debt, that now somehow has to come up with an extra 50, 60, 70 million dollars a year to support its pension fund. Now, the good news is, comparatively speaking, against other public pension funds nationally, the city pension fund is in pretty good shape. It's about 80% funded, which isn't that bad a percentage when compared to certain pension funds in Illinois, for example. But to keep it there and to try to get it to 100%, which is the goal of any pension fund, to make sure that your pension fund assets can cover your actuarially determined long-term liabilities, that's going to take an extra 50, 60, 70 million dollars a year of taxpayer money. So you put all of that together, and there's no slide that I could share with you that better paints the picture of what's going on. A lot goes into this. What this is showing you is the 2023 city budget as proposed by the mayor, and what was adopted by the Common Council is not materially different. And I want to direct your attention to that yellow bar at the bottom. The blue bars are all of the typical city revenue sources. The story here is that they fell short by about $81 million of being able to maintain the city's core services. Good news is the city had these federal American Rescue Plan Act dollars that it could use to plug a gaping hole in that operating budget. So the city in 2023 is using $81 million of these ARPA funds to preserve its core services. So good news for city residents and taxpayers and visitors in 2023. The city has one more year where it can do this. There's roughly about, there is the capacity to put about another $80 million into the general fund again in 2024. But after that, those dollars are gone. And so right there you can see at minimum, there is an $80 million hole in the city budget, in the general purposes budget, which is about $640 million total, that's going to materialize on January 1st, 2025. And that's really understating it. This is looking at a pension fund contribution of only $100 million. We think it's probably going to be closer to 120 when all is said and done. There are some other factors there. So there is about a $100 million structural gap in that city budget. And just to give you some idea of what that means, right now that $80 million is supporting about 450 positions in the Milwaukee Fire Department. Now, the city would never cut 450 positions from its fire department. It simply could not provide fire protection and emergency medical services. But if the city has to cut 450 to probably upwards of 550 or 600 positions from its workforce, that's going to have devastating service level consequences. So when you hear about a budding crisis at the city of Milwaukee, this essentially defines it. I don't want to give short shrift to Milwaukee County, but I'm going to rush through these so we have plenty of time for question. And in many, many respects, it's a similar story in that the same overwhelming reliance on these two revenue sources that aren't growing and some very fierce expenditure pressures, and now all of it is coming to a head. One difference is the county has been grappling with this for more than 2 decades. The county, as a result of the pension scandal, first started experiencing fiscal crisis back in 2002. And so I'm just showing you back to 2014, but every single year, essentially since 2002, Milwaukee County starts its budget year with a big structural gap. Now, it's not 80 to 100 million like the cities, and the county has worked very hard to make it more manageable. As you can see, 2023, that gap was the smallest it has been in years. But just the same, when you're cutting year after year after year after year, arguably a $12.5 million gap in 2023 is more difficult to deal with without inflicting real pain on your services than a much larger gap was 6 or 7 years earlier. Why does the county have this gap? Again, its fixed costs are outpacing both its local revenues and its state revenues. This is showing you local revenues. This is just showing you in a typical year. This was actually heading into the 2022 budget year. 23 was an anomaly for a few different reasons. Typically, the county can count on maybe $7 to $8 million of annual growth in its local revenues. Its state revenues are essentially always flat like the cities. And just its fixed costs, its general costs to continue in terms of what it has to increase every year for its healthcare and pensions, cost of living adjustments for its employees, general non-personnel inflationary expenses, those numbers far exceed the revenue growth. So that's by the very definition of a structural deficit. The fact that the county has its sales tax has provided it with some relief. You can see that half-cent county sales tax, while it's a $1.2 billion budget, so having $97 million of sales tax revenue, that's really helpful, but it's not one of the largest revenue sources. But still, they've seen about $32 million of growth in that sales tax. The sales tax grows with inflation. The property tax, particularly when it's capped and linked to net new construction, doesn't necessarily grow with inflation. So at least the county has enjoyed that advantage. But like the city, the county is also encountering its own fiscal cliff. In particular, that's with the county transit system. So that purple bar is sort of akin to the yellow bar I showed you on that city slide just a couple minutes ago. This is the one area of the county budget where county leaders have plugged these one-time ARPA revenues into the budget. It's to try to maintain transit service levels. And the hope from the federal government in providing specific dollars to transit systems was that eventually ridership would rebound from the depths of the pandemic and those dollars wouldn't be needed. Well, that's not happening. And so that purple is about a $21 million ARPA contribution that is propping up the transit budget in 2023. Those dollars, like the city ARPA dollars, disappear as of 1/1/25. So at minimum, a $21 million gap in the transit budget. The county's pension contributions are not scheduled to spike, though we still don't know what the impact is going to be from investment returns in 2022, very negative investment returns. But still lots of money going into the county pension fund. The bigger problem for the county is on the capital side. You've heard about this. I presented actually on the county parks a few months ago to Rotary. But the county has about $1 billion capital backlog. So unlike the city, the county has made some very successful efforts to control its debt. But there's a consequence to that. The county also has not been taking very good care of its infrastructure. A backlog has grown. It has now grown to the point that it's hard to see how the county digs its way out of this infrastructure hole. So, final slide, I promise. What's next? As I think most of you are aware, the forum doesn't take sides. We don't advocate for things like sales taxes. But we have gone on record, and I'll go on record again this afternoon, as saying that the problem, the scope and the breadth of the problem facing both of these governments is so great today that if the starting point for the conversation is we want to preserve current service levels, then I'm here to tell you it's not going to be possible to do that without some form of sizable new revenue. Does that have to be some type of new tax? Not necessarily. Could it be increased shared revenue payments from the state? It could be. I never would have even suggested that to you a year ago, but now the budget surplus, it's certainly within the realm of possibility, but it's very doubtful that even that a jump in the shared revenue program is going to be enough. So revenue has to be part of it. At the same time, clearly, there are some additional things that both of these governments are going to have to look at going forward just because this problem is so enormous. And so we have a few on this slide, looking for better ways to share services and potentially consolidate services. And we are launching a study right now with the cooperation and actually the request of the city and county to look for ways that they might be able to merge some back office services like human resources and information technology and so forth. There are movements underfoot to end the separate county and city pension systems and move new employees into the state retirement system, which is one of the best funded systems in the country. That's something that needs to be looked at. All sorts of ways to help both governments become more efficient, though I would also suggest to you that they've been cutting year after year after year already. So there are certain limitations in terms of how much money efficiency can save us. And even ideas for major restructuring have to at least be on the table in terms of much broader, wider consolidation, for example. Looking at ways that the county and the city and MMSD and MPS can cooperate on certain functions. Everything has to be on the table. So with that, I will conclude, and I hope I didn't kill your buzz too badly this afternoon, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rob. I just have a quick definitional question, I guess. You were talking on the first slide about municipal revenue, and you talked about cities and villages, not towns. And what's the difference with a town?
The only difference is the data source we had to do this comparative analysis dealt with cities and villages. And towns are different in different states. Typically, there's not much difference in the way cities and villages are financed across states, so that's the reason.
The city of Milwaukee has had their credit rating downgraded not once, but twice in the last 3 months with a negative outlook. What is the city doing to focalize on how to rectify the situation? And are they aware that the mom and pops of this world are really bankrolling Milwaukee with these municipal bonds, and these downgrades are affecting their value?
Yep. So, no question. Yes, that is factually correct. There have been downgrades. I think the downgrades are a reflection of many of the factors that we have cited here. Complete lack of ability to generate sufficient revenues to deal with some of these problems, growing pension fund payments, et cetera. Bond rating agencies look at those factors and say, you know what? And again, we are not talking about while the ratings have gone down and while there's a negative outlook, the city still enjoys ratings that are not top of the line, but if you took a look at the scale, if it was 1 to 10, they're still a 6 or a 7. They used to be much higher. So number one, they need to get control of their debt. One of the ways I think they're going to be thinking of doing that is to shrink their footprint. They can't afford to issue debt to take care of all of their capital needs, and so they have to get that debt burden under control. But very clearly, their strategy in going to Madison, that's one of the factors that they themselves cite, is that this problem is now so big that they need some help from the state in dealing with it. So again, I don't think anybody's backing away from the fact that this situation is so dire. It's going to have impacts. It means the cost of borrowing is higher. If I were a city bondholder, I wouldn't be worried about default by any means. So nonetheless, your mom and pop point is highly relevant. Yeah, this is a very alarming situation, and I think step number one is how much debt can the city afford to issue on an ongoing basis without this really escalating out of control.
You mentioned the importance of new construction in establishing the real property taxes for a municipality. Many municipalities use TIFs to encourage construction. Does the new construction under a TIF count into that additional construction? It doesn't account to the tax, but I'm just curious.
It's a great question. I'm hesitant to answer it because I don't know the answer for sure. Is there anybody in the room who knows that answer for sure? There's got to be. Jeff thinks it does. I think it does as well. So yeah, to the extent that the property tax base is growing, it doesn't matter how that growth is being financed. So I believe the TIF growth does count as that new construction. But don't quote me on that. I'd really have to go back and double check.
In this discussion of sales tax, or I assume that's kind of where we're going with the state, it might be helpful to know how much could be generated, for example, in the city of Milwaukee with the sales tax, and also some, I can't remember what, I was astounded by the figure, but I don't remember it, the number, the percentage of property in the city that is tax exempt, occupied by Marquette students and all kinds of other people who might pay, who would be paying a sales tax, but now are not contributing to the services.
So a county-wide 1% sales tax would generate about $180 million per year. And so if that were ever to occur, and that would likely need to go to the voters, there would have to be a determination as to how much of that went to the county, how much went to the city, how much went for the purposes of property tax relief, because that has been in some of the proposals, so that still would need to be determined. In terms of the non-taxable property, I believe it's about 20% of the city tax base is various types of nonprofit entities, whether those are hospitals or universities or so forth. And so they are, however, paying fees, but in terms of property taxes, they are not paying property taxes.